Welcome back everyone to the React in-depth series. In this video, what we're going to do is go over our first React components together. I'm super excited for this video since we're actually going to finally play around with React and actually get our first components up on the screen. In this video, we're actually going to go over what are called stateless components, which means that there's no state involved. I actually see a lot of courses go over kind of components with state and they kind of mix things in there together. That's definitely one way to learn things. However, I feel like in order to actually build up to that point, we really need to understand a lot of fundamental concepts of what components actually are, why they're useful, and where they're actually used, and how they work behind the scenes. So let's get right into the content to actually see what I mean by this so that we can actually build up from our stateless components, which we're going to learn in this video, and some exercises, and then eventually get up to our stateful components. All right, so to start, I kind of just want to start with this idea of what are components in the first place in the context of React. So in React, there are mainly two types of components that you're going to see people talk about. There's this idea of class components and then this idea of functional components. For this series, since we're kind of in 2023 when I'm recording this, we're pretty deep into the functional component kind of land of React. When React first came out, I think it was like 2016, or I'm not really sure on the dates on that. For the first several years, there was this idea of class components, which was relying on object-oriented programming to create components in React. They quickly moved over to this functional style of programming instead, which made a lot of things a bit easier to understand and a bit less clunky, in my opinion. Now, I don't want to get into the debate of OOP versus functional. That's for definitely another day and another video. However, do keep this in mind. There are really two ways to create components in React, and we're going to be focusing on the functional way, otherwise known as quote unquote the hooks way of creating components in React, since that's what you're going to mainly see going forward. However, if you do work on legacy or older code bases, you might see some components that are class components, and there are some cases where things can't really be done in functional components. For example, error boundaries, which you actually do need class components for. However, that's a bit more advanced, and we probably won't get to that until maybe the end of the series or some bonus content. So for now, everything we're going to be learning is functional component wise. So to start, what are these components or functional components in React? The way to think about components when you think about React is that they're really the fundamental building blocks of our web application or our React application. Components are basically, if you think of Lego, the individual Lego blocks that we can put together in different ways to actually make our castle or our website. What are these components, though, in practicality? They're actually just functions, in the case of functional components, that return JSX. There are other types of functions that we can write. Obviously, in JavaScript, we can write functions that return numbers and return functions and return arrays and all sorts of fun stuff like that. We will actually see some examples where those are useful in React later on, but when we're talking about React components specifically, we're talking about components or functions that return JSX, which is what we looked at in the previous video together, which is the JavaScript extended syntax, where we can actually write like HTML inside of our JavaScript, which is pretty cool. Okay, so the other main thing to keep in mind is as we're going through this, really think about reusability. The entire paradigm of React and programming with these kind of frameworks and libraries like React are to make it easier for us developers to actually build websites and think about websites, and also for us to go back and maintain websites in a much easier fashion than it used to be. It used to be dumped into this crazy code base with a whole bunch of JavaScript and HTML and strings and all that kind of stuff spread over the place. But with components, it's much easier to kind of think about an abstraction on top of all that, where we can say, oh, let's go fix the nav bar, or oh, let's go fix the sidebar, or the card, or the profile picture. And we can think of things in these reusable fashions so we can use them across our websites and even projects. Okay, so to start, I think I had this in our previous introduction video, but I kind of want to just show a little bit of a comparison between kind of how React does things and how we do things with the regular DOM API. So on this slide, on the left-hand side, what I have is the DOM API version of actually creating the exact same component structure or DOM structure as I have on the React on the right-hand side. So on the left, you can see that we're using the regular DOM API from the browser. I have document create element, for example. And I can loop over those, and I can do things like append and adjust the text content. And I can return all of this and wrap it all up, in this case, in a UL tag and return it from this function, right? If we look at how we would do this in kind of the React style with JSX, it's a bit more declarative, right? It's a bit easier to see. I can just say, hey, I want to return this JSX, which is a UL with these LIs with these 3 things inside of them. Right now, I don't know about you, but I think, in my opinion, the one on the right is a little bit cleaner and easier to read than the one on the left. Right? You could probably argue about that, but I think most people probably would say the one on the right. Okay. So this is really what React is and what a component is. You can see that we're returning JSX in this case. And that is exactly what I mentioned a component actually does in the context of React. And we're going to be writing a few of these together throughout this video and then also the exercises following up. Now, when it comes to the return types, what do I actually mean by returning JSX? Now, this is where things get a little bit hazy and there's a bit of blurring of the lines. And we're going to look at a demo of this really quick in our editor, but just at a high level, I'd like to start with kind of the basics. So a function in React usually returns JSX, which is what we saw, right? So for example, here, this is a bunch of JSX. I'm returning a UL tag, which has 3 LIs nested inside of it. And we saw in the previous JSX video that React is actually going to transform this into react.createElement calls. And it's actually going to kind of nest these inside each other and then return one big tag for us, right? So that's generally your most common JSX element. Now, there are other things you can return technically inside of these React components that are also valid and sometimes actually necessary. So to start, what I like to do is actually switch back to my code editor, and I'm going to start a React project, and we're going to see these one at a time just so it makes more sense. So I'm going to switch over here to VS Code, and I'm going to pull up my terminal here on the right. So I opened a folder over here, as well as a terminal in that folder. I'm just going to run npm create. We're going to use vite. I almost said byte again, at latest. And I'll just do that, and I'll just kind of run through the prompt here. And if I do that, I'm just going to say, we're going to say stateless components. You can name it whatever you like. I'm going to choose React in this case. I'm going to go with regular JavaScript. I'm just using my arrow keys to move up and down here. And then it's going to say, now I can change into that folder and then run npm install. So I'm going to change into stateless components. I'm going to run npm install. And while that installs, I'm going to kind of come in here and I'm going to look at the source code and open that up over here. So we saw in the previous videos, as we set all this up, that really what's happening is that there's a main.jsx file over here. My editor is trying to do many things at once over here. So trying to color everything and install everything as well. I'm just going to hide my terminal so we can see this a little bit better. So in the main.jsx file, this is kind of the root of the app where everything starts from. When we actually look in later videos on things like component composition and the DOM tree, this will make much more sense. But to start, the main thing that matters for us is that our app is actually being loaded up here on line 8 in the context of this particular web application. Okay, you can see it's being imported from the exact same folder app.jsx, and then we're actually using it as a JSX element over here, which is very similar to actually calling that function. So if we go to app.jsx, we have this entire app over here where we have this state, which I say we're not going to use, and we can see it's returning a bunch of JSX and exporting the app. So what I'm going to do in this case is I'm actually going to clean this up so that we actually don't really have anything over here, and I'm just going to remove it all. So I'm actually going to remove all of these imports from the very top, and I'm going to remove this set state over here, and I'm also just going to remove everything in between these regular brackets here. So the return statement is really all that's left, and I'm just going to replace this with returning. I'm going to put an h1 tag, and I'm just going to put hello in there. You know, and why not? Just for fun, I'll put a little emoji as well. Okay. So I'm going to save that. And we need a way to actually display this on the screen. So we need to start our React server so that these files actually get compiled and then served at a specific URL. So I'm going to reopen my terminal here, make sure I'm in the same folder, and I am. And I'm going to run npm run dev. And that should start up the vite server. And if I command or control click on this local URL over here, or if you can just copy and paste it or type it out, we should have it open in our browser. And I'm just going to zoom in a lot over here so we can see that. And if I inspect this, it's still formatted slightly because there's some CSS down in the actual main file, which we can get rid of later. But if I inspect this page now, what we'll actually see, that's actually a really nice looking rocket. When you zoom in on it, I actually never noticed how detailed that is. That's actually really cool. My favorite emoji right there. So we can see that there's a, let me just zoom in on this for us as well, just so we can take a look. there is a div here, ID of root, and in there is our h1 that says hello and then our rocket emoji. Okay, and if we look at the head tag, there's a bunch of stuff in there that's coming from Vite, and our script here is actually loading our main.jsx file as well. Now, some of these are only going to happen in development mode, and some of these are going to happen in production mode, and it kind of differs depending on which mode we're running in. So for now, I mainly just want to focus on the fact that we have our root, div ID of root, and then our h1, which says hello in there. So where is that coming from? Well, if we go to our main.jsx, I'm just going to hide this terminal here for a second. If we go to main.jsx, we can see that we have react dom.createRoot document.getElement by ID root, and we're rendering our whatever this JSX is inside of there. So what is document.getElement by ID of root? Well, this is being loaded up inside of index.html. So if we look at index.html, you can see that this is all the content we have in there. Inside of our body, which is right over here, we have our div ID equals root script type module loading up our JSX file, as I mentioned before. And it's this div right here on line 10 that it's grabbing by default, and we can change this later, that it's going to be mounting our React app inside of here. So it's basically appending all of our React application inside of this div, and everything runs inside of there. So when we look at our main, this app and the strict mode stuff is all basically being appended into this getElement by ID root, which is that div. So what's inside of app, this React strict mode, we can ignore that for now. So you can just imagine that we only have app in here, really. That's coming from app.jsx. And all we have in here is return hello in an h1 tag. Remember that this is not JavaScript. This is JSX, JavaScript extended. This is going to be turned into react.createElement, and it's going to be given the text node inside of it with hello and then this emoji. Okay, so that is what we're seeing in our browser over here. And again, the formatting is coming from our main file. So if we want to get rid of that formatting, we can just go to main.jsx, and we can either comment out or get rid of this index.css line right there. And if I save that and go back, we'll see kind of what we expect, which is the default no CSS running in the background for our application. Okay, now let's go back to what I had over here. We can return JSX. So that's what we just saw. We returned an H1 that has some text inside of it. Now, what I want to mention is we have to be really careful of how we do our returns inside of our elements or components. So what you'll sometimes see done is this. We're going to return an H1, and then I want to also maybe return a P tag, and I'm going to say hi, right? So if I save this, I'm going to get an error, right? I'm going to switch back here, and it's going to blow up, and it's going to say a whole bunch of stuff. Elements must be wrapped in an enclosing tag. And if I scroll over, did you want a JSX fragment? It's actually kind of helpful in this case. What this is saying is that React only wants us to return a single element with nested elements inside of it. We cannot return elements that are kind of brothers and sisters, I guess if you can say, adjacent to each other in the tree, right? We can only return one parent with a bunch of children inside of it. So how do we fix that? A lot of the time, what you're going to see is people will do this instead. They'll basically just wrap everything inside of a div tag, just like this. Okay, and if I save this file, what we'll see is that my editor actually will reformat this with Prettier installed. But what you can see here is that we have a div. If I unsave that for a second, we have a div that closes over here. We have an H1 that closes over here, and we have a P. Now my error went away just by wrapping this in a div, because now I am returning a single div element for this entire function, and everything is inside of there. So if you ever see that error, you always have to remember to wrap everything inside of a single element and return that element. That's just how React works, and it walks down this tree to render everything inside of it. So now if I switch back, what we'll see in the DOM is that I have both of these listed, and if I open the div inside of here, you'll see that we have our hello and our hi with our H1 and our P tag respectively. Now, you're probably looking at this and be like, oh, that's kind of annoying. Like, I don't really want just div everywhere. Like, there's a lot of jokes about just kind of like divception going on. So how do we kind of not have this happen, right? How do we make it so I just have the H1 and the P in there without just having these divs everywhere? So that's where this concept of a fragment comes in. So I'm skipping ahead slightly over here, but I do want to mention it because it is really important now that we're talking about it before I show you how the returns work in our components. So a React fragment is really created in two ways and solves this problem of having unnecessary tags in there just for the purposes of abiding by this rule of returning one element. So what is a fragment? By default, in the DOM, we can create a fragment using document fragment, creating a new document fragment. And that allows us to insert something and append things to it so that when it gets put into the DOM, it just gets flattened out. There's no actual parent like a div with everything inside of it. It just kind of all gets flattened out by one level so that we don't have these unnecessary containers everywhere in our application. So how do we do that in React? There's really two ways. The easiest way and the most common way is just to return these empty tags that look like this. So right here, I just got rid of the divs on the end, and you can see that this here, open close bracket, and then open close, let me zoom in a little bit more, open close bracket here, and open close bracket over here are the React fragment. Okay, and if I save this, and again, this will get formatted by my editor really quick, so you can see it a bit more clearly, just like that. That's a React fragment. Now, if I switch back, what we'll see is that now no longer is that div there. These got flattened out, and the only parent they share is the root element, which is different from what we had where we had the div in between. Okay, so when is this useful? When you don't want to have just a bunch of divs or empty containers everywhere that don't need styling on them, but you're only using it for the purpose of returning one element. Okay, now there is another way to do this, and you'll sometimes see it done both ways. I'll just show you both ways. We'll say import React from React, just so that we can actually do this. What you'll see is react.fragment. Okay, and then I'll just copy that and I'll paste it over here. And these two are the exact same thing. The only difference is this allows you to pass in what's called the key prop, which we're going to look at in future videos, which has to do with how things get re-rendered. So if we need this key prop, then you have to use this React fragment way. Otherwise, you can kind of get away with just the simple open and closing tags, and you don't even have to import React in the more modern bundlers. Okay, so I'm going to switch it back, and I'm just going to get rid of that. And I'm going to get rid of this React.fragment there, since we're not actually using that key tag, and this is the preferred way to actually make that work. All right, cool. So now I just want to share something with you about the returns, which is a little bit dangerous. Now, what we could do in theory is, let me just get rid of all of this for a second. Let's say I wanted to return a h1 tag, and I want to put my hello in there again, and I'll just put my rocket back. And I just forget to put these brackets, and I press enter here, and I put a p tag, and I put hello there. Now, in this case, the linter, which is what's running through this program behind the scenes to tell me things that are wrong with it, is actually going to tell me that this is a mistake. But you can imagine if I put a semicolon here, just to really like explicitly show you this, what you can happen if your editor doesn't notice this, and it depends on what editor you're using and what linter you're using, all that kind of stuff. This is the same issue we run into when we have multi-line returns in just regular functions. Now, I want you to think for a second. If I have this code, so I inserted the semicolon here at the end of the h1, and I put a new line for the paragraph tag, what is this app function or component going to show us on the screen? All right, so I'm going to save that. And I'm going to switch back and let's see if we're correct. So I wanted to show an h1 and a p tag. They're just separated on different lines. And I switch back and I only see that h1, right? There's no p tag. So why is that? Well, this is executing the return and this is being totally ignored. This is just a regular statement, kind of like if I had 1 + 1. And it's just going to be totally ignored. It's going to be evaluated and ignored. In this case, it's not going to be evaluated because the return comes first, but it's just going to be totally ignored. Okay, so that is why when you saw me reformat things and you see other people's code, generally what you're going to see is this structure where you're going to wrap everything in regular parentheses like this. And then you're going to probably wrap that inside of something like a fragment in this case. Okay, so now notice that I'm returning a single expression. Even though this is divided among multiple lines, notice that this bracket starts here, ends here, and the semicolon is right here on line 7 for me. right? This is one entire kind of line of code, quote unquote, where React is going to evaluate all of this JSX all at once and return it for this entire function call. Okay, and if I got rid of these brackets, then I would run into issues and potentially only return one thing and not another. So just be aware of that. Anytime you want to return a complicated JSX expression, like most of the time, most likely you're going to want to actually put some regular parentheses around it, just like this. Okay. So one other thing I do want to mention as we're here is how do we actually do comments? So if you think about it, the most obvious way to do comments in JavaScript is kind of like this. This is a comment, and I'll put a smiley face. Okay, actually, I'll get rid of that because I think those brackets are being confused. So I'll put this as a comment, right? Now, I want you to think for a second, right? Think before I show you what this looks like in the actual DOM. What do we expect to see rendered inside the browser when I save this and switch over? All right, are you ready? So look at that. We actually get this is a comment actually as a text node inside of our DOM. Right. So why is that? Well, if you think about it, this kind of makes sense, right? Because I am just telling React, hey, just render some text in this spot. It just happens to look like this comment with a // but just put some text in here. And this is more text, right? Just like that. If I save that, although I should probably put that on multiple lines. I guess it doesn't really like that. Yeah, I think in this case, I would create a whole separate text node, but it's just adding it as text nodes, which are actually a valid node in the DOM. And for example, I can add that here. I can add another one over here. I can put a 2 here, for example, and that's going to add another text node over here, right? Notice how these are actual text nodes. If you highlight them in your browser, it'll tell you usually what kind of node that is. This is a text node. You can see this is a H1 in the little purple on the top left, and then this is a P tag. Okay, so how do we actually comment this then? Well, what you're going to want to do is actually surround this as a JavaScript expression. So I'm going to put curly brackets around this, and I'm going to actually do a comment like this. I'm going to do that, and I'm going to do that. Okay. Now this is a JavaScript comment inside of our HTML. This is the same thing as a multi-line comment in regular JavaScript. We don't have single line comments in JavaScript, JSX, by default. So we have to use this multi-comment line syntax in curly brackets because we're evaluating JavaScript. So now if I switch back here, we'll see that that is gone. It's totally not there at all. And that is just inside the actual JavaScript file evaluated as JavaScript. You would think that maybe what we could do is we could do an HTML comment kind of like this. And that would work, but we cannot do that. Okay, so there are ways to do this using custom components and things like that, but by default, what you're going to see most of the time is kind of these JavaScript style comments, unless you need the actual comment to be inserted inside the actual DOM as a comment node, then you can use the custom kind of comment nodes that you can actually manually create or use a library. Okay, so hopefully that makes sense. Again, to recap that, there are React fragments. You can use them in 2 ways is the most important way or most common way to use it, but you can also import React and then use react.fragment to actually return something on multiple lines. Make sure to use regular brackets like this. And then to actually insert comments inside of JSX, make sure to actually use this curly bracket syntax with the multi-line JavaScript comment style. Okay, that was a lot, but we covered a lot of ground there. So let's keep going with this. And then we're actually getting pretty far in this and we can actually start building out some pretty cool components. The next thing that I want to show you is strings and numbers. So these can actually be inserted directly into our JSX and be returned as you would expect. So I'm actually going to get rid of all of this here for a second, and I'm just going to return a string. I'm going to say hello there. Right? And I'll save that. Now, I want you to think for a second. First of all, what do you expect React to do with this? Like if you were thinking as a React developer and you're building out this to try to make React work, like what would you want this to actually show in the DOM or not show in the DOM? All right, are you ready? I'm going to switch back. So I saved it. I'm going to switch back. And we indeed do see hello there. And if we open up our div here, you can see that this is actually inserted directly into the div as a text node. Okay, and since this is the only thing in there right now, we actually see it kind of inline in here, but this is definitely a text node inside of the div element. Okay, so a string can be returned. It's just going to be turned into a text node. So that's pretty cool. What about a number? What if I return 1000 and I save that? And I switch back, what we'll see is it too gets turned into a text node and actually gets stringified and put into the DOM. Okay, if I return any number, for example, 0.01, the same thing happens with that as well. All right, so that's pretty good to know. Strings and numbers work perfectly fine. React Elements is the whole point of all this. What about Booleans, null or undefined? Well, it turns out that these actually return and render nothing at all. So for example, if I return true and I go back to here, we'll see that this div is empty. There's absolutely nothing inside of this div right here. It's totally empty. Even if I return false, same thing happens, nothing inside of there, right? Same thing with null, save that, and same thing with undefined. And I save that, nothing in there. Okay. The reasoning for this is that there are many times where we're going to be using techniques that we'll look at in future videos. For example, things like conditional rendering, where we will actually want to return maybe true or false, depending on things that may happen or may not happen. And our functions can kind of do different things depending on certain conditions. And in some of those cases, we might be returning null or might be returning undefined or true and false. And in that case, we just want nothing to happen because we only want things to happen if we return something explicit, like usually JSX, or maybe something like a string or a number. Okay, now we saw React Fragments, right, which is empty nodes, and we can use that as opposed to, for example, a div or a section or something like that if we need it. One of the more interesting ones here, though, is an array. So we can actually return an array in React. So let's take a look at that. I'm going to switch back here. I'm going to return an empty array here in our app. Okay, and just so you're aware of what's happening here, our app is being mounted just like before. Every time we make changes to it, it's actually going to rerun all this and give us whatever our changes are rendered to our browser. And Vite is the thing that's doing this for us behind the scenes by rebundling and recompiling everything for us. So if I switch back here, empty array looks like nothing's in there. Okay, I'm going to switch things up a little bit. So I'll just put some variables up here. I'll say const str and I'll say monkey. I'm going to put str inside of this array and I'll save it. I want you to think, what is this going to show? All right, you ready? So switch back and we see monkey as a text node, hopefully as we expect, right? So what React is going to do is it's going to kind of loop through everything inside of here and turn them into JSX to put into the actual DOM. So, or evaluate them as JSX to put into the actual DOM, given those rules that we're just going over right now. So I'll say const num is equal to, let's say 1337, and I'll put our number in here as well. Now, generally you wouldn't want to mix things like this, but I just want to show you for proof of concept that this is totally valid JSX and totally valid React code. If I put our number and our string in here, as we know from our previous rules before, they both get inserted separately as text nodes. All right, now let's try something else in here. I'll say const p is equal to, let's just make a p tag. I'll say this is awesome, and I'll put a fire. Okay, so this, as we saw in the JSX video, is actually going to turn into React create element call for a p tag, and it's actually going to be a valid JSX element that we can put somewhere inside of our markup. So in here, I'm going to put a P at the end. So we have a text node. This gets turned into another text node, and this is already JSX. So if I save that and I come back here, what we'll see is that that actually gets added to the DOM as we expect as a P tag this time, which is exactly what we want. All right. Cool. So that's pretty great. Now, I guess the question is, what happens if I put an array inside of here? So I'll say ARR, and inside of this ARR, I'll put 1, 2, and 3. And I'll put that as strings. Okay. Now let's see what happens if I put this this array inside of our array. Okay, now we're getting a bit hairy here with multi-dimensional arrays, but what we'll see is those actually get rendered as their nodes as well. So React is going to go through pretty much these rules for everything that we're returning and render them correctly depending on what is in there. So this is very, very useful for us, right? So we can return arrays of all of this stuff with arrays of all that stuff with arrays of all that stuff, and it will just work as long as we follow these rules and we return the right things. At the end of the day, we really want to return React elements, usually as an array of React elements. And a lot of those might have fragments. Some of them might return Boolean or null, depending on conditions. Some of them might return strings and numbers, although this is less common, but it's entirely possible and totally valid to do. They just get inserted as text nodes. All right. Now, I want you to think for a second, what is going to happen with this array if I do this? So I'm going to do return. I'm going to say ARR. I'm going to say .map, and I'm going to just take I'll just say each item. And then for each item, I'm going to return, oh my gosh, so much hinting going on here. I'll return, let's just say an H1, and I'll put in here, I'll put the item. Okay. Now, this is definitely probably the trickiest that you'll see. I want you to think for a second what this code is actually doing, and then think about what we'll actually see rendered in the DOM once I run this. Okay, so I'm going to talk through this, and then let's see if it matches the reality of what we see when I switch over. So I'm going to save this. So we're saying take the ARR and map over it. So map works on an array. Is this an array? Yes, it is. It's an array of strings. And we're going to map over each one of these items in the array one at a time and use the callback function that was provided. So we're going to call this function right here for every single item in that array and return whatever that returns when we call the function with the item one at a time. So first we're going to return we're going to call item with 1, the string 1. We're going to get back JSX with the item inserted. Notice the curly brackets in here, which means put JavaScript, evaluate JavaScript inside of these curly brackets and then put it into the JSX. So if I change this to just item, which I'll do after, we'll see that there actually is a difference. So in this case, we're evaluating item as a variable, and in this case it's 1. So we're going to see H1 with 1, put that in the array. Then we're going to see H1 with 2, we're going to put that in the array. Then we're going to see H1 with 3, and then we're going to put that in an array. We're going to have an array of H1 with 1, H1 with 2, H1 with 3. And since that's an array of 3 H1s, React is going to map over those and put it into the DOM as 3 separate sibling H1 tags. And in the case of a map, we don't need to return all 3 of those inside of a fragment or inside of a div, because React is going to render them one at a time separately as separate elements. So if I save that and I switch back to here, what we'll see is 1, 2, and 3 rendered as 3 separate H1s, just as we would expect as actual DOM or JSX elements, in this case, H1 elements. So if I switch back here and I get rid of these curly brackets, I want you to think for a second, what are we going to see in this case? We are no longer going to evaluate each item. We're just going to put item in here just like this. So I'll save that. And I'll switch back here, and we're just going to see item, 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 because these are strings. We told it literally to put the string item inside each of these H1s, but not the actual evaluation of the variable item, which is what 1, 2, and 3 were when they're passed to our callback, because that's what we named our variable. Okay. Hopefully that makes sense. I know that was a lot, very kind of strict set of rules, but over time, you're just going to get better and better understanding of how this actually works. And it'll just kind of make more sense the more they use it and why you would use each of these versions. Now, to really wrap up just this slide real quick before I go to the last couple things to show you for this video, I want to show you something really interesting. Now, this actually surprised me, but it makes more sense the more you think about it. I want to return document.createElement, and I'm going to create a p tag. Okay, just like that. Now, this is using the regular DOM API in JavaScript. We are now going outside of React and going to the DOM API in the browser, and we're asking it to create a regular DOM node and a p tag, and we're returning that to React in this case. So do you think that this is going to work? All right, let's switch back and take a look. And okay, so we have a kind of a blank screen. There doesn't seem to be a p tag inside of this div. I'm going to switch to my console. And what we're going to see if I scroll up to the very top is a whole bunch of other errors, but this is the one that we're looking for. Uncaught error, objects are not valid as a React child. You probably will see this error a lot as you go through React. And usually it looks scary and you're kind of going to ignore it, but it's important to read these error messages. So let's go through it really quick together. So we found an object of HTML paragraph element. If you meant to render a collection of children, use an array instead. So basically what React is telling us in this case is that we are trying to return an HTML paragraph element instead of a React element in this case. Now, React doesn't know how to deal with these because each of the things that it expects to be returned from a component function in React, it expects to be JSX or a React element, not a regular DOM element. And the reason is that this DOM element has a different set of functions available to it and a different set of properties available to it that are not going to be what React needs to actually make it work. So to actually make this work, if we want just to prove it, let's take a look here. We're going to import React from React again. And I'm going to change this to react.createElement. And if I save this for a second and I switch back, what we'll see is, I'll open up my div tag here and we'll see our p tag in there. It's empty. Okay, so this is what we expected to see with the DOM API, but we don't because we can't use the DOM API to return in a React component because it expects there to be a whole bunch of properties on this object that are React specific that are not in the DOM API. All right, so you wouldn't normally do this. I just wanted to show you that what you can and cannot return and some of the errors that you might expect to see as you actually go through this process. All right, so let's keep going with this. A couple more things to show you with components. I want to create a separate slide on this topic because I think it's extremely important to understand that at the end of the day, these are just regular React or regular JavaScript functions. React components, okay, are just regular JavaScript functions. They're going to run from top to bottom just like any other function. That doesn't change. Just because it's React doesn't mean the function behavior changes at all. We can create variables, we can create functions and functions, and we, in the case of React, as I mentioned, expect it to return one of these types, but that's really it. Everything else, for the most part, unless we're using the specific React APIs like we're going to see in some other videos, are regular just JavaScript. So that means that everything up here should just be JavaScript. And this is all going to run every single time we want to show what app is showing on the screen. We're going to be creating all these variables and then returning some JSX, which is what we're seeing over here. If you look at these lines of code, none of this is React specific, except for line 6, which is JSX, which technically is not React specific either. We can be used in other libraries as well. But we could also just do create element or do some other things in here as well. So what you'll normally see is a bunch of JavaScript code, and then you're going to return some JSX at the very end of the component. But the most important thing to think of, and this is something to keep in the back of your mind as we go through future videos, is that every time React wants to show this component on the screen, it needs to execute or run the function that shows that JSX. In this case, when we want to show app on the screen, which is what we're doing right now, except it's empty, we want to execute this function. And it's going to come in here and run this function, figure out what JSX it returns, and it's going to put it in here and then render that for us. All right. So what does that look like? This is kind of what it looks like. This is what's called the component lifecycle. We're going to get deeper into this as we look at more React APIs and functions. However, this is something that's so central to understanding how React works that really I hope to kind of ingrain this into your mind as much as possible as we go through this. And I'll keep repeating it over and over again throughout the videos, really so it sinks in and where it's relevant. So the component lifecycle for every single component in React is as follows. First, we do what's called mounting the component. So I've simplified this slightly, but this is pretty much all we need to really care about as we're building apps until we get like crazy advanced stuff, in which case only slight modifications. So we mount the component, which means that we run the function to figure out what JSX needs to return in spot of that JSX. So if we think about it, when React comes to run this code over here to figure out what to show on the homepage, in this case on main in the root tag, it's going to figure out, oh, I need to figure out what's inside of app. Let me go to app and run its function to figure out what JSX to put in there. So it's going to come in here and execute this code. It's going to return react.createElement of p, and then this is literally going to get slotted into this spot and then rendered as a p tag on the screen. Okay, so that happens on mount. And that's a term I'm going to be using quite often, and you'll see in a lot of other documentation and tutorials as well. So when that happens, React still only has JSX. It needs to actually commit it to the real DOM tree, because JSX can't be displayed in the browser until React actually turns it into real regular DOM API calls. So that's what's called committing to the DOM tree. There's actually a step in between here, which you might have heard of, which is called the virtual DOM. React actually keeps this in memory and does a comparison of what kind of changes between renders, which we'll see in a second. And we'll see, especially when we look at things like state. But at the end of the day, what it's going to do is going to mount or execute that component, commit it to the DOM tree, and it's going to display it and repaint everything that we see on the browser. Okay. So if there's any changes to this JSX, especially when we're talking about things like state, which we'll look at in a future video, it's going to need to rerun this function to figure out if there has been any changes to the JSX that's going to be displayed on the screen. For example, imagine if you were typing into a search box, you would expect the results to kind of change as you're typing. We would want to re-render or update the UI to display those results, and that is what would get slotted into that kind of search section on that DOM tree. So that would get mounted and then updated as things change and get committed to that DOM tree. When something gets removed from the DOM, we call it an unmount. So for example, if I was to reload the page or switch pages and navigate between pages, if that component that I'm using is no longer needed or being displayed on the page, it gets removed from the DOM tree, and in React terminology, that's called an unmount. So if you think about it, this kind of makes sense, right? We mount something into the DOM. Then we do any updates onto that thing as it changes. And then when we don't need it anymore, we unmount it from the DOM. And these are so central to understanding how React works behind the scenes and fixing a crazy amount of bugs that end up happening as a result of issues with one of these things in the process, that I encourage you to really make sure that this makes sense. And we'll see examples of this as we progress through the course together as well. Okay, so to wrap up this video, what I want to show you is this concept of pure functions in React components. So React really moved from this paradigm of object-oriented programming with classes to this idea of functional programming with hooks. And the React team kind of introduced this idea of pure functional programming for the most part with components. What does that mean? Well, React works really well and really quickly when it knows exactly what JSX to render to the screen as things change. So that might seem obvious, and it kind of is, right? Like if I know what I want to put on the DOM and paint onto the DOM, I can kind of optimize for how to do that. So in order for that condition to be true though, there has to be this idea of a pure function. So what does that mean? I want to show you some math. And if you kind of cringe and stop the video and kind of run in the other direction, I don't blame you. But hopefully you don't do that, and you can just trust me for a couple of seconds while I explain this to you, because it's really not too bad, and I'll try to do my best to explain it to you. So if we look at this right here, I have a mathematical function. Okay, on the right-hand side of the equal signs, I have my component, which is a function, and I'm giving it some input. Now, right now, what we saw is that basically this is kind of like this function. This function right here doesn't take any input yet. In future videos, we're going to look at things called props, which we pass to components, but you can imagine that it does take some input. Now, if I call that function, I'm going to get some output, and that's going to be most likely JSX. What pure function says, and the idea of pure functions tells us that if I call a function with the same input, I expect to always 100% of the time get the same output, right? Which is what I have displayed here. If I call the paragraph function with the text boo, I expect to get this output every single time. But if that is no longer true, for example, down here, if I call the same function with the same input, but then I get different results different times, even though the inputs are the same, now this is an impure function. Okay? Now you can probably try to imagine why this would cause a lot of issues. If our function just randomly returns different things, even though the inputs don't change, then it's very hard for React to understand the DOM tree and optimize different parts of it and figure out what to do when things changes. But if we can guarantee, for the most part, that this is true, that we have what are called pure functions, then React can make a lot of assumptions and optimizations on our code to make it easier, not only for us as developers, but much faster for our application to actually run. Now, this idea goes really, really far, and there's a lot of theory behind it, and it can get quite fancy. And there's a whole debates online about this idea of what's functional programming and pure functions and impure functions. Even the word is pretty intense, pure and impure. Now, don't get too caught up with this. I just want to mention it because it does get brought up quite a lot. And this concept should be pretty familiar to you that, yeah, if I call a function and I give it some input, I would expect to get the same output, right? But that's not always true. For example, you can imagine that like when I call this function over here, I'll say, for example, const random is equal to math.random. And I can say like, if random is less than 0.5, then I want to return a paragraph element with like boo. Otherwise, I'll maybe want to return null or something like that, right? So I can return, let's just say over here, I'll return a, let's say a span, and inside of my span, it's really, really hard for me to type in this. I'll say you lose or something like that. It's very sad. Okay. Now we'll look at this later. This is something called conditional rendering, but I want you to think about this. We're running this app, right, with the same input. In this case, no input. So the arguments is nothing, but it's actually returning different things at different times. So this is technically an impure function. So if I switch back here, we'll see boo. And if I reload the page, we'll see you lose. And if I reload the page, we'll see you lose. And if I do this a whole bunch of times, we'll get different results depending on kind of what that random number ends up being at that particular moment. Now, this makes it very hard for React to optimize this code, and it can cause a lot of other issues and bugs if not done correctly. Does that mean you should never ever do this? No, but this actually breaks the rule of having pure functions inside of React, and it's just something to be aware of. And if you are doing it, make sure you're doing it for the right reasons. And we'll look at this idea of conditional rendering, for example, in the future, while actually being able to still maintain the idea of a pure function though. Okay. Now, I know that that video was a lot. I packed a whole bunch of stuff in here, and this is just with stateless components. What we're going to do in the next video is go over a bunch of exercises to practice these exact concepts and really make sure that we feel at home with them before we start piling things on top of it. I hope that this all kind of made sense to you. If you need to rewatch some parts, that might be helpful. If you did like the video and found it very useful, I'd love it if you could like the video and subscribe to the channel. I'd love to hear as well in the comments, did this make sense to you? Were there some new information? Was there things that were kind of a bit too much? Should I go a bit over the top and get too excited with some of the topics, or did it make sense overall, and was it really helpful? I really hope the exercises though help nail in these concepts, which is why I'm going to be including exercises pretty much for every single section in this series going forward for the most part. So until that exercise video, I'll see you later. Bye-bye.